Today we have a crazy story of revenge of when somebody found out their dad was inappropriately texting another guy. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, tampering with evidence? Perfect revenge for an evil boss. I used to think the devil was a man with big black horns and a long tail. At least that's the picture that was painted to us as kids in Sunday school. I grew up and realized that human beings were the actual devils, and look, it isn't always the ugly-looking ones. The most devilish people can be very good-looking. That was the case with my former boss, Mrs. A, and her husband. I was first hired by Mrs. A to watch her 7-year-old stepson and 13-month-old daughter while she and her husband attended some social events. I had no idea she and her husband were the ones hiring. Her husband was the son of a wealthy socialite, and he managed a series of businesses too. Some belonging to him and some were his family businesses. Mrs. A was an actress, a failed one if I'm going to be honest. She starred in a movie as the lead character, and that was the last time she showed her face in anything. Her acting was so horrible that everyone insisted that the only reason she was made the lead character was that she was beautiful. Some others swore that she was sleeping with whoever provided the funding for that movie. Turned out that they were nearly right, she was sleeping with his son. The movie got so popular and made a lot of money, and no one even remembered the plot. Everyone watched it to make fun of the actress who could clearly use an acting for beginners class. People took to the media to express how bad they felt for her. Some begged her to quit acting because it was cringeworthy just watching her make a fool of herself, and some suggested modeling because, well, she had the body and face for it. But acting? Nah. The week before I was hired, I had just signed up for a different domestic help agency. My mom knew the owner and had worked for him when she was younger too, so she trusted him to do right by me. At that time, I was close to graduating from my community college. The agent called me to inform me that he'd found someone interested in my services. My CV included that I was good with children, and I was, so a family saw it, were impressed, and needed me to watch their kids for 2 days. He reminded me of the rules and wrote the address on a piece of paper. I held the address in my hand, and on my way out, I saw one of the girls who had been with the agency for a while. I happily told her that I'd just gotten my first job and that from what I could see on the piece of paper, it was a rich family. She stepped back and lifted the hand where the agent had written the address. She then read it out and smiled. "Oh honey, you wouldn't last a day in that house," she said and walked away. I rolled my eyes at her and skipped away happily. All that mattered to me was that I was going to be watching the children of 2 famous people. I resumed the next day and wasn't even interviewed. My boss told me that the agency had told her all that she needed to know. She asked me to look after her kids as though they were my siblings, and then left with her husband, who barely even looked at me and did not say as much as a word to me. I got on very well with the kids. The older one wasn't as energetic as the other children I've seen around. He just sat quietly to watch TV and mostly did as he was told. The toddler, on the other hand, could not stand losing my attention for a minute. The only time I got any rest was when she was asleep. My boss and her husband returned earlier than she said they would. I noticed that one side of her face looked like she'd been punched. I immediately understood what was going on. I grew up with my aunt and her husband used to hit her every other week, so I knew. "Can you stay longer? I need you to watch them while I get some rest." That was how I worked for the meanest person I have ever known for a year and a half. I was in an abusive relationship with my boss, I kid you not, and I normally would have fled the place, but I kept justifying her behavior, kept making excuses for her. I told myself that if her husband wasn't so abusive, then she wouldn't be so abusive towards me too. My boss did wild things to me, including hitting me twice. The first time she slapped me was one afternoon in the kitchen. I was holding her toddler while fixing a bowl of cereal for the older boy. Her husband walked into the kitchen and said something to me about my eyes. I think he said I looked tired and that he could tell from my eyes that I'd not been sleeping. I thanked him and said I would make sure to get enough rest, and he left. Some minutes later, his wife entered the kitchen and asked what I was saying to her husband. I told her what he'd said, and then she asked why he was looking at my eyes. I just shrugged and told her I didn't know, but she would not let it go. I was, of course, uncomfortable with that situation, but whatever I said only made the problem worse. Still, I maintained a neutral expression and assured her that her husband was just concerned. When she asked me if I was sleeping with her husband, I could no longer keep a neutral face. I was shocked, but I told her I would never do that. She then asked why he was looking at my eyes, and in irritation, I asked her to take that question to her husband. She slapped me. Even though I was holding her baby, she hit me. I walked out of the kitchen, placed her daughter on a rug in the kids' play area, and went into my room to pack my stuff. My boss followed me immediately, begging and apologizing. She then started to cry. She didn't know what came over her, she was exhausted, and her husband must have put drugs in her drinks. She said he did that sometimes without her consent, and that he was cheating with someone but she didn't know who. She cried and begged so much that I felt bad for her. Her husband was indeed a monster, and he tried to pit us against each other because he had no business asking about my eyes, especially when he hardly ever spoke to me or even acknowledged me in that house. I forgave her, and she was glad. For the next few weeks, she behaved herself around the house. She stopped yelling at me and surprisingly started to call me by my actual name. After some weeks passed, she went back to yelling at me, calling me by the name of her previous maids. Sometimes she would ask me to go back to my country and swear that I could never survive here. It was hurtful, the things she would say to me, but each time I considered leaving, she and her husband would have another argument and he would hit her again. I kept excusing her behavior on the basis that she was just taking out the stress from her marriage on me. I kept making these excuses until she hit me the second time. This time, nothing happened. We didn't argue about anything. She was just mad about something she said I'd done. Something so stupid that I genuinely cannot remember, and she slapped me. I went into my room, shut the door, and just lay on my bed crying. I felt stupid for letting her trick me into staying the first time. I wanted to call my mom, but I felt too ashamed to do so. I didn't want her to think I was stupid. I could have told the other girls at the agency, but they would probably think I'm stupid too. My boss kept knocking, but I didn't come out. I didn't come out or open the door for the rest of that day. When I finally came out the next day, she wasn't in the house and her toddler wasn't either, just her stepson watching TV. She returned later with an immigration officer who asked if he could interview me. I agreed, and he questioned whether I was a legal immigrant. I told him I was legitimate in the country and showed him proof. After he left, I went back to my room utterly shocked about what had happened. Not only had my boss hit me, but she ran the next day to the immigration office and reported me just because she assumed that I had to be living here illegitimately. She was ready to ruin my life and uproot me from a place I'd come to know as a home, and for what? I did nothing to her and she had hit me. I was done with her, but I'm also a petty woman and I'm never really done until I've gotten my pound of flesh. When she came to me to apologize profusely, I pretended to have forgiven her. I'm sure she'd have felt very good about herself and considered me the most foolish person in the world. One afternoon, I returned from the market and met a middle-aged woman in the house. She was talking to Mrs. A in hushed tones. Mrs. A told her that she once taped her husband hitting her and that she had a hard drive containing that tape in the house. I smiled. My time had come. I heard her lawyer tell her that with that tape, they had a good chance of winning. It was clear what was going on. She was planning to divorce her husband. Mrs. A's husband was no doubt abusive, but she was also just about as evil as her husband. There was no difference between the two of them. They both had something in common, and that was their penchant for maltreating those they perceived as weaker. After her lawyer left, I sprung into action. I started wondering where she kept the hard drive. My boss had a safe in her room, and I knew the combination. Mrs. A trusted me, not because she thought I was worthy of her trust or whatever. She just thought I was too stupid to use whatever knowledge I had of her against her. Her mood improved drastically, and I suspected it was because she knew she was leaving her husband. Despite being in a happier mood, she was still as mean as she'd always been. I was getting bored of tolerating her, so one day when she left the house, I snuck into her bedroom and searched for the hard drive. It wasn't in her safe. I suspected that she wouldn't leave it there since her husband may have access to the safe. I knew that the best way to hide stuff from men was to hide it where they'd never think to check, like in your cosmetics or shoes. I looked in her shoe closet, and there it was, discreetly tucked into 1 foot of a brown-colored pair of sneakers. I took it and left for my room. In less than 2 hours, I was ready to leave her home, but I had to wait until she was back because I couldn't leave the kids by themselves. When I told her I was leaving, she told me to get out and cursed at me. A month later, my agent called me to inform me that he'd given her my phone number. Her lawyer called me shortly after and tried to trick me into admitting that I'd taken her hard drive. I denied it and shut her out. The interesting thing is that she would never know if I took it or her husband did. I later read that she filed for divorce based on domestic violence, but she withdrew the case later on. So, can we all agree, revenge? Sure. Winners? None in this story. Like, even with being treated so horribly, I couldn't imagine being in an OP situation and being like any amount satisfied knowing you trapped this woman with her abuser. That said, our next story is my revenge to my mother. I think at least once in our lifetime, it could be when we've grown older or when we're still kids, people do certain things that damage us for life, and although we cannot take gassed revenge on them based on the relationship we have with them, we just settle for the minutest inconvenience that we can make them face. This becomes our mini payback of some sort. Well, I know because it happened to me, and not that I'm proud of my actions. Looking back, it all seems like a funny story, but at that point, it was far from being hilarious. When I was 11 years old, I lived with my mom, Marina. She and my dad were split since I was 7 years old, I think, and living with mom was a roller coaster of emotions most of the time. It wasn't really that she did anything wrong in the moral terms of something being wrong, it was that she did all the right things and made others feel useless in a way. Even as a child, I noticed it. My childhood innocence felt in the way she acted. You could say she was a very organized person. She liked everything to be in the right place and always made sure things were neat and tidy. But sometimes she could get a little too stressed about little things. Even the smallest details could bother her. Despite all that, Marina was a good mom. She took care of me and made sure I had everything I needed. But do you know the worst thing for someone with this kind of personality could have? It is having a child like myself. My name is Rowan, and I was quite an adventurous kid. I loved going on adventures and exploring new things. Whether it was climbing trees or riding my bike, I was always up for trying something new. I was also pretty resourceful. Whenever I faced a problem, I always tried to find a solution on my own before asking for help. The reason was simple. I knew mom could not have more on her plate, else she would fuzz over it until she found a solution, and I would be stuck listening and watching her lose her mind on it. Even though Marina and I were different in some ways, we still got along well. She would always remind me to be careful when I went on my adventures, but she also encouraged me to explore and learn new things. Probably to get out of her hair and let her do her thing. It was midday on a school day and mom had a lot of things to do, so typically, she wanted me out of her hair and I understood that, so I took my bike out to the garage and went for a little spin around the neighborhood. I decided to stop by a couple of my friends' places to see if they were up for hanging out, and a couple of them were. So we took our bikes and just cycled around and around without a clear destination in mind. The sun was almost at its lowest and it allowed this aimless move that we had. Then we came by the forest trail. I can't remember who among them suggested that we take a race through the trail, but being kids, we did not think of the possible repercussions of doing so. It was not too long after we began the race that disaster struck out of nowhere. It was a steep turning, and with the race at the fore of my mind, I decided to navigate the tricky turn quickly without caution. But somehow, my bike hit a rough patch of ground, causing me to lose control. Before I knew it, I was tumbling to the ground, arms flailing as I tried to regain my balance. The road was kind of hilly, so it was like descending down the hill at an alarming falling rate. The pain that shot through my body as I continuously hit the floor was unbearable. In that instant, I knew that something was wrong with my arms. The pain was more than anything I'd ever felt in my entire young life at that time. I could feel my body getting scratched and all, but it wasn't until I was done with my free falling and after the shock wore off that I realized the extent of my injuries. As I lay there on the ground, the sounds of forest surrounding me, I knew I was in trouble. My arms hurt too much to move and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. I called out for help, but my friends were too far behind me to hear me. I was all alone. That brief moment before they were able to catch up with me was scary. It was lonely and frightening because I knew I could not get home by myself. But I was more scared that my mom was going to lose her mind when she saw what was wrong. In some sense, I was wrong. Thankfully, it wasn't long before help came. After my friends found me lying on the forest floor, they helped me home. They tried to dust my body and wash the dirt on my body off. I was relieved when they finally got me back, but I could still feel the pain shooting through my arms. It hurt so much, but I tried to not let it show. I would be a baby to cry in front of them, so I kept my cool. When we got home, I told my mom, Marina, what happened. I said my arms hurt, but she didn't seem too worried. Marina was always busy with work and chores around the house. She had a lot on her plate, so she didn't pay much attention to my complaints. She thought it was just a few bumps and bruises from falling off my bike. She told me to take a warm bath and have pain relief if I didn't feel better. Even though I knew that it wouldn't help, I did it regardless. But as the days went by, my arms didn't get any better. In fact, they got worse. The pain kept getting worse, and I could feel my arms swelling up. I tried to tell Marina that something was wrong, but she didn't believe me. She said I was just being dramatic and that I would be fine. It wasn't until my arms started bruising that Marina finally took notice. She could see that something was seriously wrong and she knew she had to do something about it. When she finally agreed that something was wrong, the school called her before the end of the school day that I needed to see a doctor. I had been to the school clinic the day before when the pain got worse in class, and I told them my mom would take me to the doctor that day. Since I returned to school with the same pain the next day, they decided to call her themselves. The ride to the hospital was far from funny. It was a blur of discomfort and worry. She could finally see the discomfort I was in, and I think she blamed herself a bit for not noticing on time. She was keen on details, but this was just something she thought didn't need her attention. Arriving at the hospital, Mom spoke with the doctors while I sat in the waiting room trying to ignore the throbbing pain in my arms. When the doctors finally examined me, they confirmed what I had feared. My left arm was completely broken, and my right arm was fractured. The doctors did what they were trained to do, I guess, and I was able to leave the hospital late in the evening. The ride back home was quite different from the ride to the hospital. Her mood shifted from worry to frustration. She blamed me for not being careful enough, saying that I should have been more cautious while riding my bike. I felt guilty for causing her so much stress, but I also felt it wouldn't have been a big deal if she just listened to me. Of course, I said nothing and I received her lashing words. Not that I could anyway, because I still nursed the sore pain in my body. In my young mind, I felt the blame she passed on me was unfair and unjust. She could have at least taken her fair share of the blame, but she did not. So what did I do? I decided to take revenge on my mom. Not really revenge in the extreme sense of having revenge on someone. I just wanted to show her that she could make mistakes too, even with her extreme attention to detail. But I had to wait until I could move around easily without much pain. Once the majority of the pain was out of the way, I got to work. Each morning before Marina woke up, I would sneakily hide her keys in unexpected places around the house. Sometimes I would tuck them inside a flower pot, other times beneath the sofa cushions, and once even in the cookie jar. It became a game for me finding new hiding spots to keep Marina on her toes. Each day, as Marina searched frantically for her keys, her frustration grew. I could see it in the way she furrowed her brow and clenched her jaw trying to maintain her composure. It was satisfying to see her struggle and to know that I was getting back at her for all the times she dismissed my feelings and concerns. But it wasn't just about the keys. If it was just the keys, it wouldn't have taken her long to realize that someone was messing with the placement of her keys. And since it was just the two of us, the suspicion would be me, I found other ways to mess with her routine too. I started leaving the toilet unflushed, knowing how much it bothered her. I rearranged the silverware in the kitchen drawers and changed the arrangement of things on the shelves. Nothing major, just enough to throw her off and make her question her own memory. She trusted her memory way too much, and it was sweet to see her question her sanity. She needed to know that she was not perfect and that she could get things really wrong too. As her frantic search for her keys continued day after day, I watched from the sidelines with a mixture of amusement and vindication. Despite her meticulous efforts, Mom remained oblivious to my role in the key disappearance. Instead, she attributed it to her own absent-mindedness, convinced that she must have misplaced them somewhere in the house. It was both amusing and satisfying to see her become increasingly frustrated with each failed attempt to locate her keys or check for something I had rearranged. She would scour every room, overturning cushions, rummaging through drawers, and retracing her steps multiple times, all to no avail. I couldn't help but smirk as I observed her exasperated expressions and heard her frustrated sighs. It was like a small victory for me, knowing that I was the one causing her inconvenience. Yet she still remained unaware of my mischief. Despite my satisfaction in seeing Marina's ongoing frustration, a part of me also felt a twinge of guilt. I knew that my actions were causing her unnecessary stress, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of finally getting back at her for dismissing my concerns in the past. So, after a full month had passed of messing with her, I just let the whole thing go. Surprisingly, she never found out that I was the one messing with the arrangement of stuff and her keys. I mean, to be honest, it just sounds like this poor lady is just constantly at her limit. I mean, overlooking and trying to downplay your kids' injuries when they're saying, "I am hurt, I need help," that's already bad enough, but then also to turn around and just say, "Oh, I must just be constantly, absent-mindedly misplacing my own things all the time." This poor lady is just like constantly at her limit. I mean, it doesn't sound like she sleeps. Our next story is, I caught my dad sexting a guy and anonymously sent it to my mom. I, 18-year-old female, recently found out about my dad's extracurricular activities and sent them to my mom anonymously. I live with my parents and have two siblings, Greg, 13, and Katie, 15, in a small town in Texas. We were all raised by religious parents who always made sure we went to church constantly. It wasn't so bad. I enjoyed the Sunday sermon, but sometimes my dad can be a bit annoying with how serious he takes church. He never misses a program or a midweek service. I always found it odd how he never tries to include us in his plans whenever he goes for these programs, and I once questioned him about it. He said it was up to us to decide if we wanted to go or not. The next week, I got dressed with the intention of going to church with my dad. He kept making excuses on how he didn't want us to go on his account and could stay back. I insisted, saying I didn't mind. He asked about my homework and my chores. I told him I'd done my homework, and Mom agreed to letting me go with him. We took my dad's car and passed by the church, which my dad always insisted he was going to. We stopped by a bar downtown, and my dad and I went inside. We sat down near the window, and my dad ordered a bottle of beer for himself and a Coke for me. He then told me our adventure was a little secret between me and him. I think I was about 13 then, so I felt this rush of excitement. I was going to keep my dad's little secret. We must have been at the bar for more than 10 minutes when a man walked in, and my dad smiled when he saw him. The man sat down on the chair opposite us and greeted me. I told my dad I needed to use the restroom, and he pointed me to the direction. The restroom wasn't so bad considering the state of the bar. I was on my way back to the table when I saw my dad's friend's hand underneath my dad's hand on top of the table, which they both quickly removed when they saw me coming. I didn't think too much of it and kept my dad's secret. Not too long after my dad's and I adventure, my parents constantly got into fights. They would try to be cordial with one another when we were all in the same room, but as soon as we left, the argument and quarreling began, mostly at night when they thought we had gone to sleep. This went on for a while. I wasn't sure if my siblings were also aware and chose to say nothing or they were not, but we never spoke about it. My dad was a contractor whose work took him to different places so he could travel for weeks and come back to spend time with his family. But lately, it was like whenever my dad wasn't around, that was when my mom was at her happiest. And it was a big relief for me. Don't get me wrong, I loved my dad, but I was just tired of the constant argument. After a while, my dad secured a big contract and decided to celebrate with his coworkers at home. We prepared a grill and all. My dad's friend, who I met at the bar, came too. I noticed how he was always beside my dad in every conversation, and even sat beside my dad during dinner. It was weird how he was so excessively close to my dad, but I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I said nothing. About 6 months ago, my dad fell and broke a knee while he was doing his job and was asked to take time off work to recuperate. I felt glad. Finally, I would get to spend some free time with my dad. But he just seemed so down at first. I thought he was in pain from the injury. Then I noticed how excited he got anytime he was on his phone, and he was always on his phone. Anytime he noticed someone coming into his room, he either just cut the call he was on or pretends to be tired. I was able to deal to some extent, but my siblings were feeling neglected by their dad. I tried to explain to them that it was a phase, but I knew something else was going on. I just didn't know what it was. But on the brighter side, the argument stopped and my mom and dad were able to have a proper conversation without any disagreement. My dad's work colleague and a special friend came over to say hi. That was the happiest we saw this man in weeks. I thought it was because he missed going out to work and missed his colleagues. My mom was always so busy between caring for her husband, children, and her job, so she decided to hire someone to help him out. My dad was adamant about him getting better, and how he didn't need any extra help. My mom ignored him, thinking he was trying to avoid the cost of hiring a help. She hired someone, and by the next week, she was gone, saying she couldn't cope with my dad's tantrums and overbearing attitude. We must have hired over 4 different people who still ended up quitting. My mom was tired. She tried to reason with my dad, but he just kept saying he didn't need the extra help. My mom eventually stopped hiring them and had to take some time off work as a sales rep for the company she worked for to help my dad out. It wasn't an easy decision at the time, but my mom did it anyways. I remember times when I would come back from school only to hear her crying. Needless to say, it wasn't an easy time for her. I did my best to help out with what I could, but I could only do so much since I had to go to school. Not too long after she took some time off work, I came back from school one day to find my dad sleeping with his phone next to him. I got curious as to what he did on his phone all day and gently removed it from his hands. I tried to open the phone, but it had been password protected. I tried to guess his password, but I was unable to. So I started a whole thing where I would write different password ideas at the back of my notes during my lunch break and go home to try it out on my dad's phone. And it wasn't easy to get his phone, but I was in a mission to find out what exactly this man did. Most times, I always snuck into his room by midnight to try out each password about 5 times before eventually giving up. It took me almost a month before I was finally able to get it right, but I didn't give up. If we were being honest, I knew there was something going on between my dad and his friend, but I just didn't want to believe it because if I was wrong, that would make me the bad person for thinking about him that way. But the thing was, it wasn't just his friend. There were others too. He tried to save them under archive, but I was a high schooler who knew all these tricks. I felt so bad for my mom who took time off her job just to take care of her husband, who was always stressing herself for him. And I decided to send all the evidence of my dad's affairs to my phone. I knew I had to be smart with it, so I made screenshots and airdropped it to my phone, making sure to delete the pictures from his phone. I was so angry at my dad for not only being a liar, but being a hypocrite who used religion as a disguise for cheating and pretending to be who he wasn't. There had been certain times when the gay discussion came to light, and my dad was always one of those to shun and judge them, yet he was one. I created a new WhatsApp account and sent it to my mom pretending to be one of the guys my dad was having an affair with. My mom was so shocked because I did that at the dinner table. She immediately confronted my dad, who kept denying he wasn't the one, and someone was trying to frame him. My dad played the victim card so well he even started weeping, telling my mom he would never cheat on her and said they were a bunch of lies. Whoever sent him must have been out to get him since he's been indisposed at the moment. There was no concrete evidence of him actually doing anything. I was so disgusted by this man's attitude. He couldn't be honest with himself and the woman who'd been married to him for over 20 years. My mom bought the whole thing and sat down quietly. Maybe she was in denial, or maybe she didn't want to believe that her husband of 20 years was actually gay. My siblings, on the other hand, I could not tell what they were thinking. The next day was a Saturday. I was in my room when my younger brother came in and sat by the edge of the bed, asking me if I truly believed Dad wasn't cheating on my mom. I told him no, and he immediately fessed up that he didn't believe him. He had once caught Dad in a compromising state with a friend, and he told him to keep his little secret. It was then that I realized maybe my sister knows more than she lets on. I spoke to my sister that evening, and she also had something to say. We all agreed to talk to our mom regarding the matter the next day. After church, my dad stayed back to do something while our mom drove us home. I decided to bring up the topic of my dad's affairs to my mom, and this time, with the help of my siblings backing me up, I told my mom about how I was the one who sent the anonymous messages. She was shocked at this. I then told about what I knew. She tried to shush me to not say anything in front of my siblings, but she was even more shocked when she found out they knew more than they let on. My mom parked by the side of the road and began weeping, saying she also suspected as much, but she didn't want us knowing, so she tried to play dumb. It was an emotional day for us. After telling her what we knew, she decided to get a lawyer, but my dad was just recovering at the time and my mom couldn't leave him in that state, so she stayed back till he got better, then gave him the divorce paper to sign. It was painful to see my dad still denying that he was gay despite everything. We were all disappointed. After a lot of back and forth, he signed the paper and apologized to my mom for all he had done. My dad moved out of the house, and my mom has been getting better and is actually a lot more happier than when she was with my dad. She was able to get her job back and has been much more better than she used to be. My dad calls from time to time, but he never comes around to see us. Maybe he's ashamed to face us after what he did. I didn't hate him. I just wish he'd been more honest rather than lying. So, is it wrong of me to assume him going to church so much and insisting on going to church so much is just like his desperate attempt to somehow still deny that he's gay despite being with this guy? I mean, I genuinely wonder if he even has any remorse for the cheating, or if it is just more so all tied up in the shame that he feels upon himself for being gay. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.